Well, Scarbs, the McLaren MP430 Honda has now finally hit the tarmac. Well, kind of. It's kind of hit the computer screen anyway. Very odd-looking livery on the car, I thought. The way that red jumps out at you. And we were all expecting a bit of orange on the car, I think, so kind of shame, but at least at this launch phase that there's no orange on the car. But nonetheless, here it is, the new MP430. What are your first impressions?
First impressions really is that they've changed a lot of the car, and a lot of the old McLaren designs have kind of been thrown out of the window. I'd say very much this is probably one of the few really all-new cars. There's not many concepts carried over from the previous one. Obviously, they've got the really neat packaging of the Honda power unit. They've gone for a very different nose. Up until Ferrari launched it, it was the only really long flat nose that we'd seen. And they've done lots of work around the side pods and around the cockpit area, really to shrink that bodywork in quite tightly. And I think it's one of these cars that's going to have a few changes when it actually hits the tracks. I think it's actually hiding some secrets in the car there.
What do you see that bears the imprint of Pete Prod, the Adrian Newey, former aerodynamicist from Red Bull, who worked so closely with Adrian, who's now at McLaren?
There's a few areas. I think the obvious one is probably in the front wing, which we saw when it was tested at the very last race last year at Abu Dhabi. Lots of Red Bull influence, and again throwing away very much the what was existing McLaren design there. Also in the nose, as much as the nose doesn't look like anything that's been raced by Red Bull in recent years, some of the little details around there and how they're treating where the slope of the nose goes up into the flat top of the monocoque suggest that I think they could be introducing one of those S-ducts that we originally saw on Sauber, and as we know, Red Bull and later Toro Rosso have both adopted with some success. It's a good way of managing airflow over a slightly unusually shaped nose. So I think that's probably one of the key areas. And certainly since the RB5 in 2009, one of the key designs of the Red Bull has been the very tightly packaged side pods, where they've pushed all the radiators right up the front of the side pod and then brought the side pods in as close as you possibly can and keeping the outlet area to a minimum. And I think that again is a trademark of this new McLaren, and you could say that it's a Red Bull trademark as well. So again, all this sort of stuff bodes really well for McLaren's competitiveness once they get there with their teething problems with a very new car and a very new power unit sorted out. By regulation, the battery has to be underneath the fuel tank area. However, it's the rest of the packaging of the electronics, how they've packaged the turbo. We know that Honda are already running a split turbo, much like the Mercedes. And it'll be interesting what they do with the intercooling package. We saw there was an air-to-air intercooler on the MP429H, which was the interim car that they were trying to get running during winter testing. So I think there's lots of secrets to be revealed under the skin of this car.
What do you think will be the approach to aerodynamics versus engine development? In other words, how practical have they had to make this car in terms of working around temperatures? Obviously, there are going to be some glitches as the engine first runs in the first few races, first few tests. How do you think that they're approaching that from an aerodynamic point of view? Performance versus practicality, I guess, is my point.
Well, I think one of the things already you can notice just by the rear end of the McLaren is that the Honda power unit is packaged very tightly into the chassis, and there were technical director interviews where they were saying how tight the chassis is in getting everything packed away. And they're lucky because they've had, albeit not a particularly successful test, but they've had some running with the new engine in the old car. And as much as we saw some temporary cooling requirements bolted into that to get the car working, I think what's transpired here is that they seem to have a car where they're able to really reduce the cooling package in the envelope that the engine needs to be packaged in to create this really tight rear end. So I think that they've probably got a good compromise. Hopefully they don't suffer with overheating in the first few tests, but I think they should have enough data to be fairly sure that won't be a problem.
And we also know that they've done a lot of sculpting work, if that's the right phrase, on the gearbox. And the gearbox is now probably, I would guess, somewhere near Williams in terms of its mass and proportions.
Yes, again, the rear end packaging is quite interesting. It's one of the things which is partly at least carried over from the 2014 car, where they've got this quite unusual rear suspension set up on the gearbox and the rear crash structure. We don't know if they're going to be running this mushroom fairing that they ran last year, but the layout of the suspension suggests that it would do. But equally, when we look at the way Peter has packaged the aerodynamics at the back, I don't think we're going to see a return of these big mushroom fairings. But the result is that some of the load is taken out of the high areas of the gearbox, and you're able to get a much lower gearbox, as you say, and a much lower rear crash structure. So the rear end packaging is quite neat, and it's a nice crossover between existing McLaren design and what the aero department are trying to do in 2015.
Lots of interesting things on this car, Scarbs. Of course, a lot of it is to do with how well this Honda power unit is going to perform. And if you could just give us an update now on the latest situation, because about 3 weeks ago, it looked as if Honda were not going to be able to do any upgrades at all during the season. But that's changed now. That situation has changed.
That's right, Peter. Originally, Honda were excluded from being able to use tokens during the year to further develop the engine during the season. Since then, Charlie Whiting has put out a clarification, and they seem to have reached a fair compromise between no development and almost too much development compared with the other teams. So it's very hard to word this in one sentence, but Honda will be able to use the average number of unused tokens by the other three manufacturers as of the start of the season at Melbourne. So basically, if Ferrari and Renault have got 8 unused tokens and Mercedes have 12 unused tokens, the average of that will be worked out, and that will be the number that Honda can use during the year. I think this is quite fair. It doesn't allow them to change everything if they had their full, I think, 46 tokens available, but it does give them the chance to, in fairness, recover from any problems that they do have, rather than being tied into it when their competitors will be able to still do development during the year. So complicated working out, but I think the compromise is right for everybody.
Well, thanks for explaining that. And I think, so far as the fans are concerned, it just basically means that Honda can do some in-season development,
yes,
which was not the situation 3 weeks ago. So that's good news for them. Of course, they're also exclusive with McLaren, and that is also an advantage in its own right. So lots of things pointing in the right direction for this team right now. Let's see how it performs. Fernando Alonso back at McLaren alongside Jenson Button, and lots of hope for the future down at Woking. Thanks, Scarbs, again for your detailed analysis of this car, and we'll move on to some others. We have plenty of other new cars to talk about as well.